Hello my friends, and welcome to this week's Wandering Wednesday from here at the Curate Study. Come in and take a seat and make yourself comfortable because this is quite a long one. In fact, this is the beginning of what's going to be a series of YouTube videos about our particular subject. So I've been wondering this week, why does God allow suffering? Now I need to give you a bit of a health warning on this next series of YouTube videos because this is a controversial topic, mainly because it strikes right at the heart of people's lives. You see, you may be suffering right now, and if you aren't, the chances are you know somebody who is, or if you have even half an idea of what's occurring around the world at the moment, you will know that undoubtedly millions of people will be suffering. And unfortunately, the bad news is, if you aren't suffering now, you probably will be at some indeterminate point in the future, or will have done in the past, or probably both. So my intention here in this series of videos is not to attempt to provide you with some sort of trite answers, but really just to run through some of the issues and to provoke thought and maybe conversation as to why a good God might allow suffering to happen. But with this, with most of my other thinking, I'm just about smart enough to realise how little I know. So I'm not going to be able to give you answers to why you or those you love might be suffering. So Stephen Fry, the famous comedian, a very clever man, was once on a chat show whose host was in the habit of asking his guests in the last few moments, if you had the opportunity to ask God one question, what would you say to him? And Stephen Fry said, and I'm paraphrasing here, something along the lines of, how dare you? How dare you allow children to suffer from cancer? And then he went on to explain how outraged he was of the amount of suffering in the human condition. And I think he tapped into something very visceral there for us as a species, because pretty much all of us will have asked that question, or will ask that question at some point in the future. It's a gut reaction. It's something we can't help ourselves with. And it's precisely why charities, of course, use heart-rending images in their promotional material in an attempt to raise funds. Because even the most hardened of us can't fail to respond when we see acute human suffering. And there is so much suffering in the world, isn't there, in so many different forms, from violence and abuse, through disease, warfare and famine, and so on. The list just goes on. Emotional, physical, mental, spiritual suffering. And it must result in, for those of us who believe in a God, in asking that very profound question. How can a God that we love and we believe who loves us allow humanity to suffer on such a scale? So Bart Ehrman, the very gifted Bible scholar, who's written a number of books, who I'm a bit of a fan of, himself was a Christian for a very long time. And he only lost his faith not because of some inconsistencies he found in the Bible, but because he could not reconcile this question of how a good God could allow suffering. Now, if we don't believe in God, then really it isn't so much of an issue for us, the existence of suffering. If we have a purely reductionist and scientific view of the world, then we must understand that the universe is a cold and pitiless place, and things will just happen. And in some respect, of course, it also means that other than any sort of localized contextual meaning we gain for our own life, as life is ultimately meaningless, then suffering is also meaningless on any universal scale that we might imagine. But as I say, for those of us who believe in a God, it is a big issue. And we would do well to spend some time thinking about it, because it is such an essential, but such a big part of all of our lives. Now, the German philosopher and mathematician, I think I'm pronouncing this correctly, Gottfried Leibniz, coined the term theodicy in 1710. in 1710, to encompass conversations which attempt to justify the existence of an all-powerful and good God, that's key, in the obvious existence of suffering and evil in the world that he's created. So he coined that term, but he didn't start the conversation about the topic. It certainly goes back at least as far as the biblical scriptures we have, where there is a large amount of conversation about the existence of evil and suffering, not least of all, of course, in the book of Job, almost the entirety of which is dedicated to that one question. But the conversation itself, I suspect, actually goes back far beyond Christian scriptures into the dawn of human sentience. So one of the key arguments, if it can be summed up in such a short couple of sentences, is God is omnipotent. He is all-powerful and all-knowing. And God is wholly good. And yet evil exists. So how is this possible if God is both all-powerful and all-good? How can God allow such evil to exist in the world and therefore suffering to occur? Now, as I say, this is a massive area of conversation, and in one Wandering Wednesday, we can't even begin to skim the surface of it. It's going to be difficult even to define the terms that we're going to operate within. So what I intend to do is to split this down into several Wandering Wednesdays, which I shall probably call something catchy, like the problem of suffering and evil 1, possibly the problem of suffering and evil 2, and maybe even the problem of suffering and evil 3. You get where I'm going with it. But if we are mature, we need to acknowledge, as Christians, we need to spend some time thinking about this. And I don't think I'm being negative in my assertion that human life is characterized in many cases by our experience of our suffering and the suffering of others. So, you will have no doubt noticed at this point that I've shifted from originally talking about just the problem of suffering into talking also about the problem of suffering and evil. And this is because the general view taken by philosophers and theologians is that the two are linked, inasmuch as it is the presence of evil in the world which causes suffering. And hence the subsidiary question of that, of course, was how did evil come to be in the world that God created in the first place? So like most human beings, I would like to think I've spent some time thinking about this, because I'm no more immune to suffering than anybody else. And actually, part of the question I'm not sure is entirely accurate, or part of the phraseology is not entirely accurate. What I mean by that is, I don't necessarily think that evil is the only cause of suffering in the world. It is quite probably a primary cause, but certainly not the only cause, and perhaps we'll get round to that later. So first, here we are in the catchily named problem of suffering and evil 1. So let's try and define terms before we go on to discuss them and explore them together. What do we mean, first of all, by suffering? Well, I think we could probably agree that suffering is the bearing or undergoing of pain or distress. So suffering can also take place, of course, vicariously. By that I mean you may suffer because you know that someone you know or love is suffering. You may not be directly experiencing pain, for example, but you could suffer as a result of someone else you know suffering pain. And suffering, as I said before, I don't believe is always the result of evil, or is always necessarily experienced through direct or vicarious experience. You can suffer, of course, just knowing that people elsewhere in the world are suffering, even if they aren't people that you know, although, of course, experience teaches us that's far less likely. It's always easier to dismiss the suffering of others if they are someone we don't know and they live a very long way away. But ironically, from a biological perspective, the existence of pain and hence suffering in our bodies is transmitted through the same receptors and nervous system which transmits pleasure. It surprises many people to know that there are no separate nerve endings that pick up the sensation of pain compared to the sensation of pleasure. So likewise, what might be pain for some people can be perceived as pleasure for others. An easy example to think of would be tickling. Some people find that quite distressing, other people enjoy it. And, of course, what starts off at pleasure can quickly become pain and cause suffering. Warmth would be an example of that. That would be easy to think of. So initially, the feeling of warmth is a pleasurable sensation, but if it increases steadily, it can become pain and, of course, result in damage. So science also clearly shows that pain is both contextual and individual. That is why we talk about individuals having a particularly high pain threshold, and why almost any suffering broadly experienced is a unique sensation. So what might cause you anxiety, for example, and therefore suffering, wouldn't necessarily cause me any anxiety, or vice versa. So in its broadest sense, pain and anxiety and fear, all of which which clearly cause suffering, can also be good things. What do I mean by that? Well, without them, our lives would be even shorter and possibly a lot more painful, wouldn't they? Think about this. So the child who has no fear of being hit by a train is likely to be killed by one. Now, there are rational and irrational fears which cause distress and suffering, but some fears are clearly very, very rational and should be taken into account as how we live and plan our lives. People often talk about an irrational fear of heights. Personally, I don't think there's anything irrational about the fear of falling off of a high building, whereas the fear of a melon perhaps might be considered to be an irrational fear. But the man who doesn't remove his hand from a candle because of pain is going to see that hand become a lot more damaged, isn't he? Pain in a joint or a muscle can indicate overuse, and perhaps through too much strain or too much weight being lifted. And those people who are born without the ability to feel pain and hence suffer at some level are at real risk from injury, infection, or considerably worse, because they have no indication that their body is either being damaged or risks being damaged. Likewise, anybody who was born with absolutely no ability to fear or feel worried about anything would quite probably live an extremely short life. Now, also, stress, of course, can cause suffering. However, a degree of stress for some people can mean extra motivation and productivity. Fear can cause real suffering, and yet for some, the rush of adrenaline caused by the fear associated with dangerous sports can be incredibly rewarding. Suffering can also be experienced in some respects both consciously and unconsciously, in that the degrees of damage that can be caused to our body or minds without us realizing it's happening can be quite profound. So the damage to our mental health, for example, through certain lifestyles or certain diets. Now, we can debate the terms which we apply to this, but I would argue these are still forms of suffering, even if we don't fully understand at the time what is happening to us. But what is unique to human beings, or at least it seems so, is that we have an extra dimension to our suffering which other species do not share. So our suffering can be virtual. I mean, we can suffer in the present because of things which may or may not happen in the future through the power of our imagination. Now, humans are sentient creatures, obviously. And we have a sense of self, and we have a sense of place, and we have a sense of time, which is inexorably linked to our sentience, isn't it? Now, that in some respects, it gives us a blessing and a curse, which is our imagination. You see, imagination is a powerful tool for the human species because it allows for human development, or it gives the opportunity for human development. We can create little virtual models of ourselves going forward in the future and then try out all kinds of different scenarios on them, can't we? This allows us to make plans for the future, to design things which might be useful for tomorrow, to store food, create tools, create new technologies, even to develop civilizations and empires. All of these require imagination to be able to implement them. However, the downside from this is it allows us to worry about the future. Now, creatures like ants lay up supplies for the future, but they do it by blind instinct. They're not thinking through the consequences of not doing it. We, on the other hand, in our plans, have an awareness of why we're doing it. And what that means is that sometimes we can overlay it with our anxieties and our fears. We can do is we can imagine horrors, we can imagine illnesses, we can imagine accidents, we can imagine problems, some of which we may never ever encounter, but they will cause us to suffer in the here and the now. So I think you're beginning to get the picture of where I'm going with this. The topic of suffering and its various subsets are immensely complex. And we haven't even got into the area, possibly, or got into the area of those people who possibly enjoy suffering in some form or another. So I think we've probably had enough of suffering for one Wondering Wednesday. And so I'm going to draw this particular session to a close. I think it's probably given you a great deal to think about. I hope, as complex as it is, it's whetted your appetite for more next week, when we will begin to look at different categories of evil and trying to define the term evil and what we imagine it does mean, and perhaps even more interestingly, what it might mean. It's been a pleasure to have you here with me today, my friends. If nothing else, it's provoked me to do a huge amount of research. When I first sat down, I thought on my computer to start thinking about this Wondering Wednesday, I thought I might be able to précis it down into 1 week. What a fool I was. It's probably going to be at least 3, but it's already proved for me to be a very interesting journey, and I hope the same will be true for you. Until we meet again, my friends, may God hold you in the palm of his hand. God bless.